It was a time when every dawn brought tension in the air. The Jewish people were still licking their wounds from the wars against the Seleucids, and the name Maccabee sounded like a song of resistance. It was against this backdrop that JOÃO HIRCANO was born, son of Simon, one of the great heroes of the Jewish revolt. His birth was not accompanied by grand celebrations or prophecies announced in public squares. It came in the silence of a home marked by struggle, where each child unknowingly carried a piece of the hope of a people tired of invaders. Simon was not just a father, he was a warrior, a ruler, a symbol. He raised John amid the smell of gunpowder, the whispered stories of his brothers Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan, and the shadow of the rebuilt walls of Jerusalem. John grew up hearing more stories of battles than parables of peace. His childhood was shaped by expectation. No one said it, but everyone looked at him as if to say, "You will be next," and he felt it. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. If this content touches your heart and you want to support us, feel free to click on the Thanks a Lot button. All help is welcome and makes a big difference. But time, treacherous as a disguised enemy, began to whisper threats. Simon's alliances, once firm, began to creak. The world around them did not want peace. Every party was viewed with suspicion. Every smile could hide a knife. And it was precisely at a banquet, which should have been a moment of celebration, that tragedy reared its ugly head. Ptolemy, Simon's son-in-law, a man of soft speech and twisted intentions, drew his sword in the dead of night and sealed the family's fate. John escaped, not by luck, but by providence. Suddenly, the young man who had barely tasted the joys of youth found himself with the weight of a people on his shoulders. His eyes were dry, his heart hardened, and his sword firm in his hand. There was no time to cry. Leadership was calling, and John, still with the voice of a teenager, would have to respond like a man. And there, amid mourning and mud, began the rise of someone who would not only be a leader, it was a night of celebration. Candles flickered on the stone walls, and the aroma of food mingled with the laughter of the guests. Simon, JOãO's father, was surrounded by people he considered trustworthy, including his own son-in-law, Ptolemy, who smiled too much and toasted too loudly. At first glance, it was just another banquet among allies, but under the table, a sharp betrayal was already brewing. No one heard the exact sound of the blade piercing the flesh. It was all over in an instant. Blood, screams, running. In the blink of an eye, the banquet turned into a massacre. Simon was murdered. 2 of his sons, too, and Ptolemy. He disappeared into the shadows with the coldness of someone who kills without remorse. John, by a thread of fate or a divine push, escaped. He fled the scene like someone running from a fire, his heart burning and his soul scorched. There was no time to understand, only to act. With his father dead and the people adrift, John was forced to take control. It was as if he had been pushed onto a stage, with the curtains already open, the lights on, and a crowd waiting for a hero. But he was still young. He had no beard, no war experience like his Maccabean uncles. He had only pain and urgency. Even so, he did not hesitate. He summoned men, strengthened positions, and confronted Ptolemy head-on. But the traitor, cunning as a snake in the bush, retreated and hid behind hostages, including John's own mother. He threatened, blackmailed, and played dirty. John did not back down. He knew that now he was not just a grieving son. He was the guardian of a legacy. The people needed someone who would not tremble in the face of evil. It was thus, amid blood-stained swords and decisions that hurt more than wounds, that JOÁO HIRCANO began to take shape. But what lay ahead was not just war with men. It was an even greater challenge, where faith and power would mix in unexpected ways. With the blood of battle still warm and his heart heavy with loss, JOÁO HIRCANO gradually ceased to be just a young man who had survived betrayal. He was becoming something that few had the courage to be. A leader who mixed heaven with the sword. He was not crowned king, not yet, but he assumed the most sacred office of the people, that of high priest. He was the man between the people and God, the one who entered the temple, offered sacrifices, and carried the spiritual weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. But John did not wear only white linen robes. He also wore armor. The same man who offered incense at the altar also gave orders on the battlefield. It was a scene that defied logic, a priest with the heart of a warrior, and the people watched in silence, not knowing if this was a blessing or a harbinger of conflict. Jerusalem breathed a little easier. There was order, there was direction, but on the edges of the territory, the enemy still lurked. Antiochus II, the Seleucid king, did not accept Jewish independence as definitive. He surrounded Jerusalem with a huge army, as if to say, "It's not over yet." The siege was tight, famine began to set in, and John found himself facing his first great trial as a ruler. But then something happened that no one expected. Antiochus was called away to resolve problems in the east, and on the way, ended up dying. The siege collapsed like a house of cards, and John, quick as a flash, saw an opening. Instead of retreating, he advanced. He took cities and expanded the borders. Where once there had been threat, now there was conquest. But with each victory came a silent question. How far was this warrior priest willing to go? With the way clear after the death of Antiochus VII, John Hyrcanus wasted no time. It was as if he could smell opportunity in the air, and without hesitation, he went for it. What began as defense turned into expansion. First Shechem, then Dosa, Marissa, Akrabatin. One by one, the cities fell like dominoes under the advance of a man who seemed more like a king than a priest. But there was one place John could not ignore: Samaria. It was not just a city, it was a symbol. There were the Samaritans, a people who shared roots with the Jews but followed their own cult, with their temple on top of Mount Gerizim, a mountain that for many challenged Jerusalem. It was an ancient dispute over faith and identity. John knew this. He knew what it represented. So when the time came, he didn't just take Samaria. He ordered the temple on the mountain to be destroyed, stone by stone. It was as if he were saying, there is only one place where God should be worshipped. And it's not here. The message echoed far and wide. The Samaritans were in shock. The Jews were torn between pride and concern, because this act was not just military, it was spiritual. It was an assertion of authority that mixed politics with faith, as if they were flour and water in bread that was already rising too fast. But John didn't stop there. He went down to Idumea, a territory to the south, where a people lived who had long been enemies of Israel. And there, instead of just conquering, he did something even more radical. He forced the Idumeans to convert to Judaism. Circumcision, laws, customs, everything. Like someone who takes a river and tries to bend it with his hands. And in the midst of this silent imposition, an Idumean family was born that years later would leave its mark on history. A name began to whisper behind the scenes: Herod. The Idumeans were a tough people to swallow. Old rivals of the Jews, they had a history of friction, mistrust, and bloodshed in the southern deserts. But John Hyrcanus, with his direct and blunt manner, did not want to just defeat them with the sword. He wanted something deeper, to turn the enemy into a brother, or at least into someone who looked like one. When he conquered Idumea, he left no room for negotiation. He made a simple demand, but one as heavy as a rock: either become like us or get out. And so it was. The Idumeans were forced to be circumcised and follow Jewish laws, not out of faith, but for survival. It was a forced, soulless conversion imposed by force. In John's eyes, it seemed like a clever move. Fewer enemies in the future, more unity under his command. But little did he know that this act would be a strange seed planted in even stranger soil. a seed that years later would sprout into something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Among the Idumean families forcibly converted was one that no one paid much attention to. They were simple, unremarkable people, but from there, in the following generations, Herod the Great would be born, a man who, in the future, would stain the corridors of power with blood. It was as if John had pressed a spring that would return with much greater force. But at that moment, it was just a distant whisper in time. Inside Jerusalem, the situation was beginning to change. John was no longer seen as just a warrior priest. He was a true ruler, a conqueror, a strategist, a man of firm decisions. But as he grew outward, something inside began to crack. The Pharisees, an influential religious group, began to take issue with the way things were going. Whispers turned into criticism, and criticism soon turned into confrontation. In the beginning, John walked side by side with the Pharisees. They were respected scholars of the law, men who knew what to say and when to say it. It was a natural alliance, a high priest who also ruled the people, surrounded by advisors who knew the Torah like the back of their hands. For a while it worked. John took care of the borders, they took care of the people's conscience, but it only took a spark for this powder keg to explode. One day, during a celebration, a Pharisee stood up and raised a question aloud. He questioned whether John was really a descendant of Aaron, as tradition dictated for the high priest. It fell like thunder in the temple. It wasn't just a question, it was an open wound in front of everyone. John was silent for a moment, but inside something broke. He didn't forget. Little by little he began to distance himself. The tone of the conversations changed. The compliments turned into suspicious glances. And when he had the chance, John approached the Sadducees, a group very different from the Pharisees. The Sadducees were more political, more practical, richer. They didn't care so much about ancient traditions or what the rabbis said in the narrow alleys of Jerusalem. John, who was already feeling more like a king than a priest, saw new support there. Quieter, more convenient. The break was inevitable. Where there had once been unity, there was now division. The Pharisees, hurt, began to openly criticize his decisions. They said he had strayed, that he was contaminated by power. John, in turn, hardened even more. He silenced some. He ignored others. Faith, which had once been the foundation, was now a battlefield. And while the leaders fought internally, outside, the people began to realize that something was changing, not just in politics, but in the very spirit of the nation. Because with every step toward absolute power, John left behind something essential, and sooner or later, that would take its toll. Time passed and JOÃO HIRCANO seemed untouchable. He conquered lands, ruled Jerusalem with an iron fist, and his word was law. Many already treated him as king, even though he had never officially used that title. Coins began to circulate with his name engraved on them, a symbol of power, of dominion, of someone who was no longer accountable to anyone. The city grew. The territory was the largest Israel had ever had since the time of Solomon. The walls were standing, the temple was functioning, and the people, at least on the surface, seemed secure. But there was something strange in the air, a silence, a discomfort, like a warm breeze before a storm, because the more John grew on the outside, the more he emptied himself on the inside. Sacrifices were still being made in the temple, but the fervor was no longer the same. The brightness of faith gave way to the glint of swords. The priest who once sought God's guidance now made decisions based on strategy. The altar and the throne began to blend together so much that no one knew where one ended and the other began. And the people who once prayed together now whispered behind closed doors. Inside the houses, the conversation was always the same. Has John forgotten where he came from? Families still remembered the time of the Maccabees, when everything was a struggle for freedom and faith. Now, all they saw was luxury, power, and an increasing coldness. And as if that weren't enough, internal tensions continued to grow. The Pharisees did not forgive his closeness to the Sadducees. The Sadducees took advantage of the distance. And John, in the midst of it all, ruled with a firm hand, but with increasingly distant eyes. On the outside, the empire seemed as strong as a rock. On the inside, it was beginning to crack. And when cracks appear, it doesn't take long for someone to try to stick a knife in. The palace walls were thick, built to withstand attacks from outside. But there was no stone that could hold back what was fermenting inside. In the last years of JOÁO HIRCANO, the atmosphere in Jerusalem became tense. You no longer saw the same smiles on the streets, nor the same looks of admiration. There was respect, of course, but it was that cold, silent respect, the kind that comes more from fear than from love. John no longer walked among the people as he once did. His decisions came from afar, surrounded by advisors who told him what he wanted to hear. The Pharisees, once allies, had become almost enemies. They called him a traitor to the faith. They said he had become a king disguised as a priest. He in turn silenced them. He arrested some. He excluded others. The temple, once full of faith, was now the scene of subtle disputes, cutting glances and dry prayers. But it wasn't just inside the temple that the ground was shaking. Inside John's own home, the atmosphere was also unstable. He had children, 5, and they were all growing up in their father's shadow, learning from him what power was and how to get it. But none of them saw the world through the same eyes. Hidden disputes were already brewing among them, small skirmishes, gestures that seemed insignificant but were poisonous. John, too busy with external enemies and internal pressures, may not have noticed. Or maybe he did, and chose to ignore it. The truth is that the old warrior was no longer the same. Age had come with the weight of the years. Decisions, once firm as a hammer blow, now came more slowly. And the people, impatient, began to look at his sons with curiosity. Who would be next? Who would inherit the throne that he never officially wanted, but that everyone knew was his? And it was in this atmosphere, full of tension, pride, silence, and expectation, that JOÁO began to say goodbye to life. But his death, instead of bringing peace, would be the trigger for something even more dangerous. Because the children he left behind were not interested in inheriting just the name. They wanted power, and they would do anything for it. JOÁO HIRCANO died in silence. No spectacle, no grand speeches. He just passed away. After decades in charge, he left like a tired old man who knew he could no longer hold the world in his hands. What did he leave behind? A strong territory, yes. A temple still standing, yes. But also a trail of divisions, open wounds, and children hungry for power. It didn't take long for the dust of death to turn into smoke of conflict. Among his 5 sons, one moved faster than the others. Aristobulus. His name was already circulating in the corridors even before John was buried. Unlike his father, he had no doubts about what he wanted, and he wanted everything. Not just the high priesthood, he wanted the crown. And without ceremony, without even pretending modesty, he proclaimed himself king. It was a step John had never taken. He had always used his power, but avoided the title. Aristobulus had no such restraint. He broke centuries of tradition with a snap of his fingers. The people watched, shocked. A priest who was now also king. The mix was complete, and with it, the ghosts that John had held back for so long began to emerge from the shadows. But Aristobulus was not just ambitious. He was suspicious, violent, cruel. He had his own mother arrested, accusing her of conspiring against him. Some say he let her starve to death. Others say he was more direct. He also had one of his brothers executed. Family became a threat. Blood became an obstacle. The people, who had previously accepted the Hasmonean leadership with a certain reverence, now began to feel fear. Something had changed. It was no longer about protecting the faith or defending the temple. It was about keeping the throne, whatever the cost. And behind the curtains, other eyes were already watching. In the wake of JOÁO HIRCANO, a larger, stronger, but also more unstable land remained. His name was still remembered with respect for a time. After all, he had expanded borders, protected the temple, and consolidated a type of government that many saw as modern, a leadership that mixed faith and power. But time showed that this mixture, while powerful, was also dangerous. What began as an ideal turned into ambition, and what seemed like a conquest turned out to be a burden. The Hasmonean dynasty, which he had strengthened so much, began to crumble under the weight of its own choices. Internal strife, family betrayals, alliances made for convenience, a cycle of bloodshed that seemed to have no end. Each son wanted to be greater than his father. Each generation was further removed from the faith that had motivated the Maccabean revolt. It was in this vacuum, in this space of confusion and thirst for power, that a new figure began to emerge. Herod, a descendant of those same Idumeans whom John had forced to convert. A man who carried the scar of imposition in his blood and the desire to sit on the throne in his heart. He was everything John had tried to avoid. A foreign king with the appearance of a Jew, but the soul of Rome. Herod arrived smiling, promising order. He married a woman from the Hasmonean family, as if to say, "Look, I am with you." But inside, he was already plotting the steps that would lead him to destroy that very lineage. One by one, John's descendants were eliminated. What began with faith ended in silence. The silence that followed John Hyrcanus was not only the end of an era, it was a warning. A whisper that echoes to this day, as if trying to tell a truth that time has insisted on hiding. His story is full of strength, courage, and victories that marked the people, but it is also marked by choices that, over time, took a heavy toll. JOÁO began as the son of a hero, survived a brutal betrayal, and held the people in his hands when all seemed lost. He built, protected, and expanded, but along the way, he traded the altar for the crown, and then the boundaries of his soul became blurred. He strayed from the simple faith that had brought him there. Power began to guide his steps, and with it came divisions, internal conflicts, and invisible enemies that lived within his own home. The lesson that remains is not only about politics or war, it is about the heart, about how easy it is to lose yourself when conquest becomes obsession, when government becomes vanity, and when faith is used as a tool instead of being lived with truth. John thought he could hold both worlds, the spiritual and the political, like someone carrying water in both hands, but eventually one always slips away. And yet his story is not just about downfall, it is human, deeply human. Because who has never been torn between what is right and what is necessary? Who has never wanted to protect what they have built, even if it meant becoming hardened? JOÁO made mistakes, yes, but he also fought like few others, and perhaps that is what makes his story so vivid. Today, looking back, the question is not whether he won, but rather, what will we who have heard his story do with what we have learned? Because perhaps JOÁO HIRCANO's greatest legacy is not what he built with his hands, but what he compels us to build within ourselves. If you enjoyed the story of John the Hyrcanian and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.